Hope that wasn't on the whole time. So, have you ever wondered, you ever look and here's somebody that can't stand you, and you start looking deep within yourself. Did I do something? Did I say something? Why does this person hate me? Why do they treat me the way they do? Have you ever had that where you're the innocent one? You've looked and you've looked and you're looking fairly, and it's not a thing of, okay, I did them wrong, so now that's why they're doing me wrong. But I'm saying, truthfully and honestly, you haven't done anything. Actually, everything you've done for the person is good. You haven't mistreated them. You haven't said anything. And yet this person continues to have this vendetta or this aim that they're going to ruin you or do something like that. What do you do in that case? How do you respond? How would you react to that? We have an example of a man who had that happen to him. And so I want to look at how David viewed and treated King Saul. So turn to 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel we see that what happens here is these people who had God as their king wanted a king. That was never in God's commandments. That was never something He said He wanted them to do. It was evil in their minds. They just wanted to be like the nations around them. And they were trading God, who was their king, for a man. Because that's what everybody else was doing. And by doing that, Samuel is upset. But God tells Samuel, they haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. But here's what we're going to do. I want you to warn them, if you get a king, this is the kind of king you're going to have. He's going to take your daughters, make them as cooks. He's going to take your sons, and they're just going to be pawns in his army. And he's going to tax you, and he's going to multiply wives to himself, and he's going to be selfish, and he's going to do all of this for him and build his kingdom up. And this is really what you want. This is what you're going to get. They say, oh, we want a king. We have to have a king. That's what the other nations are doing. So that desire to fit in and be like everybody else, then God says, okay, Samuel, I want you to go and find this man, and I want you to take your horn of oil, and I want you to anoint him. And that's what he does. He picks Saul. And at first, King Saul, when he comes to him and finds him and he anoints him, he is humble. He is saying, me. And he's thinking of himself as little. Who am I? How can I do this? And what's so interesting, when he goes home to tell his dad, he doesn't tell his dad. And then later what happens is when they announce him, he's hiding. They're bringing out all the tribes and they're going to name the one that's going to be the king. He's hiding among the stuff. So he doesn't seem to be at first so prideful and ready to, yeah, let me be the king. I want to be this. I want this position. Lift me up. But through time, after he's anointed, after he's announced as king, something happens along the way. The position and power goes to the head. And he becomes corrupted. But not at first. After he was crowned, do you know what happens? They make him a king, and there were men within his own kingdom that say, I'm not going to let him reign over us. We're not going to follow him. He's not our king. And there would have been other people who would have said, that's treason. Bring them out. If they won't follow the king, let's execute them. And Saul, at first, he says, he holds his peace. They have a battle. They win. And then after they win the battle, they remember what those men did, that they weren't going to follow him. And they said, now bring them out. Let's Let's do away with them. And Saul says, nobody's going to die today. We've had a great victory. And so, look what he's doing. At first, he's humble and he's not vengeful. But through time, this is what happens. Something happens along the way. In chapter 13, what occurs is they're in a real pickle. They're surrounded by a large army, okay? And they're waiting on the prophet Samuel to come and make a sacrifice. Okay, now he's the one to do the sacrifice. Saul doesn't have the right to make a sacrifice because he's not of the Levitical priesthood. He's not a priest. He's a king, but he's not priest. He doesn't have this authority. But he's waiting on Samuel for 7 days. Then what happens is Samuel doesn't show up. You know, a preacher that's late. Imagine that. So he's not showing up, but they're supposed to figure out. They're going to go and inquire of God and ask, what should we do? Should we go in this battle or not? Are we going to be able to win? Or should we retreat? What do we do? And his army is scattered from him. And so being antsy, I got to know right now. And can't wait, can't be patient because of the pressure he's under. He makes a sacrifice, which he was not supposed to do. And as soon as he makes the sacrifice, guess who shows up? Samuel the prophet. And when he does, in chapter 13, what happens, Samuel tells him these words. In verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. The Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee." If Saul had done what he was supposed to, the Lord said he would establish his kingdom forever. He would have had that lineage. But because he usurped that authority, God's going to take it away and give it to another man who's going to seek God. Well, we know that man is going to be David. Well, as the story goes, guess what happens? Here's how David enters the picture. There is this evil spirit, harmful spirit. That's the idea that comes from the Lord. And Saul is troubled. I don't know if he was just in a state of depression or torment or just gloom. And so what he does is, the people in his kingdom say, let's have somebody bring in someone to play some music to calm him down, soothe his spirit. And guess who's picked? David. The young man who can play well on a, King James says harp, some versions say lyre. So he's coming and he's playing before him, comforting Saul. Now here's what's interesting, is Samuel anoints David as king. Now here's the thing. When David comes out, when Samuel goes to anoint another king, and he goes to the house of Jesse and he sees the tallest, the oldest, Eliab, he's surely the Lord's anointed. And God says, not him. Man looks on the outward, but God looks on the heart. So that's what God is looking for, the heart that David has. And that's important for us to know, because this is the attitude of the man that we're talking about, how he views Saul, who becomes his greatest enemy and threat to his life. His greatest torment throughout his life. And so what happens is, David is playing the harp before him. Now imagine this. Instead of him anointing Eliab, the oldest, He goes through all the seven sons of Jesse, and finally comes to the youngest, which is David. David's the youngest. God says that's him. So he anoints David. So now, imagine you're David, if you will. You're David. You know, don't you think the word has gotten around? Saul has rejected God. Saul made a sacrifice. God is no longer with him. Saul also, somewhere in this, is supposed to go and fight against the Amalekites. He doesn't do it exactly like God says. He leaves some. And because of that, Samuel says, God has rejected you from being king, and I'm going to give it to your neighbor who is better than you. Voila, David. Now imagine you're David and you knew these things. Now you're anointed. What's going through your mind if you're David? Are you thinking, I'm anointed now. This guy, get him out of here. He's a reckless cannon. You know, and also here's another factor. There's another battle where Saul makes demands that are too harsh, too hard to follow. He's becoming an ineffective leader because Saul is in this battle and they're surrounded, and he says, none of my soldiers are allowed to eat till the evening. Till we have won this battle, do not eat a thing. Thinking, okay, that's going to motivate his soldiers. Let's get this battle over with so we can eat. Sounds like maybe a tactic. Sounds pretty radical. Maybe that might work. His son Jonathan doesn't hear that command. And so he's over there fighting, and he ends up defeating a large number of people. They end up winning this battle because of the count of his son Jonathan. But Jonathan, because he didn't hear the command not to eat, he grabs a little honey for himself. Takes some. These men are hungry, and to the point where they're weak. And when Jonathan is able to take a little bit of honey, his eyes are brightened. He's able to have a little bit more energy. And when it comes to find out, somebody has eaten. Who is it? Whoever it is, let him die. Even if it's my son, he's going to bring him out here and let him die. Let's find out who it is. And Jonathan is thinking, I didn't know this, but my father has troubled the land because, look, I was able to eat a little bit of honey, and look what I was able to do. How much more if the rest of the army had been able to eat a little bit, we'd have been able to do more. So that was a king who's overexerting his authority. So I wanted you to see that. Don't you know David knows about this? If you're David, somewhere in this picture, do you know about these stories? Are you thinking now that you're anointed, you're supposed to be king? Let's get this guy out of here. Let me in and I'll do a better job. David's not like that, though. That's not his attitude. His attitude is very patient. His attitude is very wise. And he doesn't have this ill will towards King Saul. And what he rather does throughout this story, if you go home and read this, that's kind of what I want you to do, because I'm skipping over a lot of detail. I want you to go and read this and see how many times David views King Saul as the Lord's anointed. So he's not going to do anything harmful to him. The Lord anointed him. I'm not going to do anything out of the way. I'm going to be loyal to him. And he is. Enter the story of King Goliath, or soldier Goliath. He's the great champion of the Philistines, the army that's giving the Israelites all this trouble throughout this story. And so this guy is so big. I don't know exactly how tall he was, depending on what a size of a cubit was. 6 cubits and a span. Anywhere from 7 feet tall to 10 feet tall, somewhere in there, we'll just say it that way. Big guy. so large, everybody's afraid. And he's taunting Israel. Send a man down, and here's what we're going to do. If I will fight against him, if he defeats me, we'll be your servants. If I defeat him, you'll be our servants. I dare you. And everybody's shaking in their boots. Nobody wants to go down there. But David says, because his dad sends him to go check on his brothers, who are soldiers, they're older. And they go down there, he goes down there to check on them, bring them some food. And then David says, what's going to happen to the guy who defeats Goliath? And do you know what the prize is? The prize is, you get the king's daughter, and he's going to make you wealthy, and make your whole family wealthy. And you're going to get a name in Israel. Well, David says, let me at him. He's an uncircumcised Philistine, and he goes to Saul. Now, he's already been playing for Saul. The Saul doesn't seem to really recognize him. He doesn't know who he is yet. But what happens is, because of this battle, David goes out, not because he's the greatest warrior. He might have had some talent there. But David says, I don't come to you with sword. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. The battle belongs to the Lord. And he defeats Goliath with a sling and a stone. And guess what? Where's the daughter supposed to get? No daughter yet. Saul does not keep his promise. If you're David at this point, what do you think? Where's my daughter? Or, where's my throne? Yeah, I defeated this. Yeah, let me in there. I'm king now. If he's that kind of a person, David's not that kind of person. David is happy to serve the king in his position, waiting on the Lord and waiting on his time. Well, no daughter given. But do you know what happens? Later, Saul promises the older daughter again to David. And then guess what happens? No daughter. Another failed promise. Then, his younger daughter takes a liking to David. And Saul says, okay, here's my chance to do him in by my daughter. So he's going to use his daughter as his pawn. Let's let them take this relationship where it goes. Okay, David, you can have my youngest daughter. And David says, who am I that I should be the king's son-in-law? Again, he's very humble. That's the heart of David. Very thankful. Just gratitude, happy to serve. But then, Saul says, oh, by the way, I don't want a dowry. That's what they did in those days. Instead of a dowry, instead of money, I want 100 Philistines. David gives 200. Now, you got to understand, Saul's thinking in this whole thing was not, oh, I'm glad to give you my daughter because you've proved yourself to be an honorable man. No, he's saying, let's think here. I'll let him have my daughter, but put him out there in the battle, and the Philistines will kill him, and I'll get rid of this guy, and so I don't have to worry about him taking my throne. That's what's taking place. Yet David does this. And here's another part of the story that's crucial. When David defeats Goliath, and because of his battles, the women come out with celebration. Their great enemy, Goliath, is dead, and they say, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Now, how does Saul take that? He can't stand that. Jealousy starts to set in. If they've ascribed to me only thousands, but to David 10,000s, what more could he have than the kingdom? So Saul goes on this twisted, demented hunt to figure out a way to kill David. But you know what David does? Continues to play before him. Continues to fight battles for him. Continues to be loyal to him. And somewhere along the way, while David is playing before Saul, Saul takes his javelin and tries to thrust him through to the wall. And David escapes twice. Sometime later, there's another incident where he does it again. So there's at least 3 times where this happens. Now, not all this is exactly chronological order. But I want you to see also just the difficulty that David is now facing. Would you be afraid for your life? At this point, just so far, again, if you're David, would you think, you know what? If I stay where I'm at and I do nothing and I just keep working for this guy that keeps wanting me dead, that fails his promises, that is not doing right by the people, he's not following God, God's already rejected him, he's already anointed me, what's taking it so long? Why don't I just go ahead? Would it be so bad if I would just go ahead and get rid of this guy, and then all of my troubles will be over with, and now I can be a king and I can do right? A lot of people think, put me in that position and I could do what? Everybody thinks that. But not David. David is still very patient, very humble. He still views Saul as the Lord's anointed. He's not going to harm him. On through the story. In chapter 20, we find that David and Jonathan become close friends, very close friends. And David is asking, which is interesting, Jonathan is not power hungry either. He's a valiant man. Remember, he's the one that won the one battle. He ended up escaping the death that his father wanted to inflict on him because the soldiers stood by him and rescued him because he won. But Jonathan is not saying, I'm the son of the king. I've got the rightful heir or place to the throne. But no, he loves David. His soul is knit to David. He loves him even as his own soul. And David is asking Jonathan, what have I done that your father hates me? What have I done that he wants my life? And yet, David in chapter 20 verse 3, he says these words. 20 verse 3. There is but a step between me and death. Now, again, if you're David, you're realizing, one day I'm going to die. I am that close. My life is hanging by a thread because this guy is so jealous of me, he wants me dead. And I've never done him harm. Why wouldn't you gather a group of soldiers and overtake the throne at least? Put him in jail or something. Yet David never does that. David ends up being separated from Jonathan. Saul is so demented at this point, he's mad at his own son. And he tries to thrust him through with the javelin. Well, Jonathan makes a pact with David. I'm not going to harm you. One day you're going to be king, and I'm going to be second to you. And I'm going to be loyal to you. And it's good to have friends along the way in this. It's refreshing whenever you've got an enemy that wants it in for you, but yet here's the thing. Jonathan is Saul's son, but Jonathan is nothing like his dad. His dad is a jealous, angry, and rebellious against God, and Jonathan's nothing like that. You don't have to be like, if you have a parent who has these kinds of problems inwardly, and you don't have to be like your parent. You can be like Jonathan. And be loyal to your friends where it's needed. Well, there's more to the story that you got to understand. It makes this even harder for David. Because David and Jonathan end up getting separated. Your close friend, the one person that has been so loyal to you that you would love to spend more time with than anybody else, you get separated from him because of this whole thing. You're robbed, all because of King Saul. Now how do you feel about him? And yet David doesn't have this anger. He's hurt, but he's still loyal. Well, he flees. He's so desperate, he goes into the house of the priests. He's so hungry. Do you have any food? They don't have any food. The only food they got is the showbread, which was only for the priest. Now, how desperate do you got to be to know that wasn't allowed? But he's so desperate, he's going to take of that the priest gives to him. Later, there's somebody there present who is on Saul's side and tells Saul. Saul comes in a rampage and kills 85 priests because he says, you're not loyal to me. I want David dead. And he kills 85 priests. And he kills women and children, and animals are included in that slaughter. And do you know how David responds? Does he say, get him out of there? I'm really, at this point, I'm becoming really amazed at David's attitude, why he is not ready to retaliate. Don't you think David could? If he can defeat Goliath, if he can defeat 200 Philistines, if he can do all of the battles that he's doing at this point and winning, don't you think he could figure out a way to get rid of his biggest problem? And yet he doesn't. He waits on the Lord. He does not seek revenge. But David, when he finds out that 85 priests have died, he blames himself. Because he feels like he endangered them by going there. So he goes further away. Do you know where he goes? Of all places to go, he goes to Achish. Guess who Achish is king of? Gath. Guess where Goliath was from? Gath. You mean you're going to the enemy? You're going to the people? To the king of the people that of the giant you defeated? Don't you think they want you dead? Now, how bad does it got to be that you think it's safer to be in the enemy's territory than to be in your home territory because Saul wants you dead? Well, later what happens is Saul goes into a cave where David happens to be. David's living in a cave. By the way, if you're David, you're living in caves. How long would it take you for that to just get old and feel like, you know what? I want to be at home. I want to be in my bed. I don't just want to be in my bed. I want to be in a king's bed. I could be in a palace. I could be in a nice house and have servants. And yet I've got to sleep here in a cave. Now Saul comes into the cave to relieve himself. Here's your chance. And your men are saying, here's our chance. Let's kill him. And David says, do not put your hand on the Lord's anointed. I'm telling you, why would you have that mentality at that point? Here's your opportunity. And you know what David does? He sneaks over, cuts off a piece of his garment. Saul gets out of the cave, and David says, hey, what's this? He's got a piece of his garment, as if to say, I could have killed you. But you know what happens to David? It says his heart smote him. He felt bad. He had a conscience. He felt bad for cutting off a piece of the garment of the Lord's anointed. What an attitude that he has that we can learn from. And you know what Saul says at this point? He says, David, you are more righteous than I. You've done me good, and I've repaid you evil. I know one day you're going to be king. And then it's like he agrees he's going to stop seeking him. Do you think that stops? That's just one event. Time passes. There's more battles. There's more time where Saul is hunting David. David's living in a wilderness. David's living out in some pit somewhere, some ditch somewhere, and his men too. And on another occasion, while Saul is in this hot pursuit after David, Saul is sleeping one night. David sneaks down there and grabs the spear by his head, runs up to the top of the hill, yells down, "Hey, what's this?" And he's saying to Abner, who was the general, "What you doing, Abner? You're not protecting the Lord's anointed." As if a way, you need to protect him. Now, why would you care so much about protecting the guy that wants you dead? And then Saul, you know what Saul says? He says, "I've played the fool." But yet, he does not seek him, stop seeking him. David says, "One day I'm going to die at the hand of Saul." This keeps on, and it keeps on. And you know what happens? David ends up going back to Gath, and he's fighting for the enemy. They're out doing these battles, and he's fighting for the enemy. Now, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that. He's fighting for the enemy simply to buy his time until something happens with Saul. David is saying, someday what's going to happen is Saul may die at the hand of his enemies, but not by me. I'm not going to be the one to do it. I will not put my hand against the Lord's anointed. Well, somewhere in the picture while David is fleeing Saul, do you know what Saul does with David's wife? Gives her to another man. Now, how would you feel about that? Would you say enough is enough? Now it's hitting home, hitting personal. And somewhere along the way, whenever David is in Gath working for the enemy, do you know what happens? They're supposed to go out to a battle, and the enemy says, the men are talking, "We don't want David to go to this battle with us because we don't trust him." David is saying, "I haven't done anything." So as he's headed back home, guess what they find out? The Amalekites have come and taken all the your soldiers' wives and burnt your places where you live. And the men that are with you, your small group of soldiers, are ready to stone you and get another leader because of this. And would you ever just say, "You know what? I am done with this. I am tired of this. The Lord anointed me. I should be king." And yet he doesn't. I mean, this is story after story after story. Now, what happens is when, I'm going to skip ahead, Saul and Jonathan die. The day comes where Saul dies. If you're David, after all of this running, let me back up just a second. The reason why I mentioned how the Amalekites took David's wives, why that stings is that's Saul's fault. Because the Amalekites would not have been alive if Saul had obeyed God like God told him to and go and kill them all like he told them to. They would have been wiped out. David would have never lost his wives for a while. They would have never lost their houses. So there's another one. But he got his wives rescued. David's not vengeful. The day comes whenever Saul dies. Do you go, whew? Do you throw a party? Do you celebrate? I'm going to be king. Finally, relief. Is that what he does? I am really, this is where it really gets interesting, is look at David's response. A man, what happens in that battle is Saul wants, he knows he's in for it. So he tells his armor bearer, I don't want them to torture me, so you thrust me through. Well, he won't, because he won't do that to the Lord's anointed. So Saul does it himself, which no one should ever do, by the way. Please don't ever do that. This is the actions of a man who is so wrong, if you can ever see that. That's not the way to be. Okay? Don't ever do that. There's a way out. But there's this guy who goes, cha-ching, I got an idea. Here's my opportunity to make myself elevated. He's an Amalekite, by the way. He goes running to David. And he says, Saul would have been tortured. So he asked me to thrust him through, so I helped him out of his misery. Thinking David was going to elevate him. Do you know what David does? David has him executed because he said, you should not have done that to the Lord's anointed. So it was murder. Come to find out, the man had lied. But it still shows you the attitude of David. That he thought it was wrong to harm the Lord's anointed. Well, when the time comes for the funeral, David is weeping. He weeps for Jonathan because that was his best friend. But he's also weeping for Saul. Look what he says in 1 Samuel. Actually go to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 17. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. This is what he says. The beauty of Israel is slain upon the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Is that how you would view your enemy? Would you view him as the mighty? The beauty of Israel? He says, tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. He doesn't want the enemies to be laughing and rejoicing. David's not rejoicing over this. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul as though he had not been anointed with oil. There's that recognition that God chose Saul. So he's not going to rebel against God by hurting someone that God has anointed. So verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives. And in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Would you say that about Saul if you were David? Be honest. They were lovely and pleasant. They were swifter than eagles. Verse 24, ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How is he able to see the good in this man? There was a time when there was some good in him. How is he able to do that? How is he able? There's some people that once you cross them, they can't see any other thing. Everything else is discounted. That's not David. Verse 25, how are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? He lost his best friend. Some people want to pervert that statement there and make it like it was a homosexual relationship. It was not. When it says it was past the love of women. It is saying that it was better than a romantic love. They were that close. But you were separated from him because of this man who is so jealous of you. You know, time passes, one more. Now you're king. You get to be king. But you know the problem? Because this man who has been such a thorn in your side, because of his doings and not handing it over peacefully because God gave him the kingdom, your son Ishbosheth is made king. And Abner, the general of the army, is now serving you, serving Ishbosheth, who's the son of Saul. And so David doesn't have the whole kingdom. At this point, for about 7.5 years, I think, the kingdom is serving Saul. And it says there was a long time war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You know your troubles still aren't over even after this man is long dead. Would you still ever have a difficulty holding a grudge against the man even long after he's gone on? And yet Saul does not. What happens eventually is the general of the army for Saul's son. Do you want to know what causes him to switch sides? Something real petty. He's with the concubine of Saul. And so Saul's son, who's now king, doesn't like that. And so he questions Abner the general. Why are you with my father's concubine? You know what Abner does? Like a prideful man. How dare you question me over this woman? From now on, I'm going to be on David's side. I'm switching sides now. When he goes to switch sides, do you know what happens? One of his family members is killed because he was pursued. So then, not in a moment of battle, the man who ended up defending himself that killed his relative, he finds him in a moment of peace. He goes like he's going to hug him or kiss him, like a greeting, like a friend would do, a comrade. And he grabs him by the beard and he thrusts him through. That's what Joab does to Abner, the general of the enemy's army, if you want to think about it that way. David doesn't think about it that way, though. When Abner is killed like that, David says, died Abner as a fool? That was not an honorable way for it to take place. And David is following the coffin, weeping behind him. And he's lamenting. And you can read about that and read what he says to see his attitude. And the people see how David responds. And they all know David didn't have that done. He didn't pay anybody. He didn't order that to be done. Because David is not that kind of a man. He's not revengeful. He's not jealous. He's not overexerting his authority. He's patient. He's not bitter. He's not cynical, even though he's hurt. Even though it cost him a lot of torment and trouble in many years. What do you do to somebody who's mistreated you? Have you ever been mistreated this bad by anybody? And yet you find it difficult to let it go? Have you ever done that where you're just, I'm having a hard time forgiving this person. I'm having a hard time. Learn from David. David viewed Saul as the Lord's anointed. What if you viewed another individual as someone made in the image of God who has a soul? What if they are your brother or sister in Christ? What if you viewed them as someone bought by the blood of the Lord? Or if they're not a Christian, the Lord died for them. So at least have that kind of honor and feelings that they are a person. Okay, maybe they've got these problems inwardly. Maybe they're directed towards you and you're suffering because of it. But it is not your place. It's not you. Let the Lord take care of that. Let that go and let the Lord deal with them. And don't wish harm on them in the meantime. In the meantime, do good to your enemies. That's what Jesus taught us. Love them that hate you. Pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. That's the way to respond. Don't you want to have this kind of a purpose in life that you know you're following the Lord? Why not give it all over to the Lord this morning, believing with all your heart? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Turn from your ways. Give up whatever ill feelings you have. Give up whatever sins that you've been committing. Decide you're going to turn that all over to God. Be baptized. Confessing, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. Be baptized and be forgiven. And then forgive others. That's what Jesus did on the cross. It's a wonderful message how we can all be forgiven. If we want to be forgiven, we've got to learn how to extend this same kind of grace to other people. You can have it if you're a Christian. Don't forget these things. Hang on. If you're being hurt, the Lord knows. Go to the Lord and ask the Lord to help you. Ask us. We're here to help you and pray with you, whatever your need is. Come forward while we stand and as we sing.